I want to switch over now to talk about the adaptive tone mapping process. I'm going to merge another image for this, 12 exposures in this scene. And again, when I said you want to make sure that you have an image that covers all of the highlight detail. This is the low dynamic range histogram of this scene. And you can see that when the highlights are butting up against the sides here, that you're going to run into clipping. So you want to make sure that you have everything covered here. And the best place to look for that is when you're taking the photos and look at the histogram on the back of your camera. If you have that gap between the right edge of the histogram and the histogram frame, then you know you've captured all of your highlight information. Now this is a very wide dynamic range scene. I'm going to use the merge static photos options on this. Again, this was taken with a tripod, so the camera was stabilized and there's nothing moving in this frame. And this will provide the smoothest tonal range for me. So I'm going to click merge. This will take a moment to go through the process. And I'll just check in with Alfred to see if there are any questions on what we've covered so far.
Yes. Do you get better quality by using manual alignment, not forcing a weighting and alignment using a keyframe?
If you use manual alignment, then the precision is really your burden. Then, I mean, if you're going to do the manual alignment, you have to make sure that you find those exact points. The bottom line is it takes longer to do it manually. So we made the automatic features, and they're very robust. I would advise that you try out the automatic settings first. If they're good enough, I'd leave it there. I only would go to the manual settings if you have real alignment issues that we're not able to address automatic. The automatic algorithms are really quite good, so that would be my first choice.
Can chromatic aberration be confused with ghosting?
No, chromatic aberration is a lens defect or an optical defect that gives you fringing along high contrast transitions. So if you're shooting through a fence, and you have black fence and a bright background, you'll often see color fringe along the edge of the black fence, and it'll be green on one side and magenta on the other side typically. And the amount of the fringing will will change as you get further away from the center of the image. So the further you are into the corners, typically, the more dramatic the chromatic aberration is. So that's a very different optical effect than ghosting. Ghosting is having moving objects between individual frames. So chromatic aberration will show up in every frame, every single frame. Ghosting never shows up in a single frame because ghosting is overlapping of multiple frames. So let's take a look at this particular image that I showed here. I want to highlight how the 32-bit processing works. This image has a dynamic range of over 20 stops. What you're looking at here is the untone mapped 32-bit image. So you say, well, where did the room go? The room is down here. If you look at the histogram here, you have the full tonal range that is in this HDR image. This light gray box represents what we call the display zone. So this is the approximately 8 stop range that you can show on your computer screen. This little triangle here shows me where the cursor is hovering over. So you can see that now it's in the dark area inside the room, and as I move through the window, you can see that triangle scoot up the curve into the clouds. If I move this down, you can see parts of the image start to disappear while other parts start to appear. And if I now zoom in down here in the darkest shadow areas, you can see since I use the merge static images option, which again set the keyframe tuning rate value down to 0, I have no noise in this image, which is really astounding because I haven't done any noise processing, so there's no blurring or anything going on from from noise removal. What I'm doing here is using the taking the shadow information for this 32-bit image is coming from the dramatically overexposed frames. So by completely overexposing those frames, I'm essentially shifting the shadows from the dark shadows areas that the sensor produces noise in up into the midtone or the highlight range where it has a very clean signal to noise ratio. So I'm essentially taking the sweet spot out of each one of these frames and then merging them into this 32-bit image that I'm going to process. So let me zoom out again. This is the 32-bit image. Now to tone map this now, all I have to do is click on one of my presets here. So the tone map linear preset automatically tone maps this image, and I get something that looks like this right off the bat. So you can see I have my highlight, detail, and contrast outside the windows. I don't have any halos around the windows. I have good shadow detail inside the room. And this was all automatic using the tone map linear preset, which is the default preset that the image is then opened with. I could apply a different preset to see a different effect or a different look on this image. You typically will want to go in and start with a preset and then make some adjustments to that. So in this case, if I wanted to lighten or darken the image, like I said, I had the gamma slider here. I'll take this just down a notch. And again, if you remember what I showed you in the PowerPoint slide, how this works, the adaptive tone curve is basically angled around the highlights, and I'm adjusting the angle to darken the image. Okay, so I can darken it if I want, it's more of a moody look in here, or I can raise that angle and brighten the whole area. So this is really quite dramatic because I'm able to capture the highlight detail and everything outside the window, as well as the shadow information here in one shot. I'm not having to do two separate processes and then mask the windows out and do layers and things like that in Photoshop. If I adjust the exposure of this frame, again, I'm not changing the shape of the histogram. I'm simply shifting the whole thing side to side. So that's the difference between gamma and exposure. And typically, you're going to make brightness adjustments. You're going to use the gamma slider. If you want to, you have a highlight mask here. You can see that there's this little tiny area outside of the histogram that would show me highlights that are currently clipped. And when I turn the highlight mask on, you can see that they're represented here in red. I can recover that with the highlight slider down to the point that it's, as far as I really need to recover that. If that little speck is clipped, it's probably not as critical to the scene. Same with the shadows. I can open the shadow areas or darken the shadows with the shadow slider. Black point is a truly neutral black point, and especially if you're doing black and white photography, black and white HDR, you want to have a strong Dmax in the scene. The black point slider will do that for you. We use our own color space for processing this image. Completely separates the brightness channel from the color channel. So all the tone mapping that you're doing, all the contrast and brightness adjustments are only happening on the brightness channel. We're not affecting the colors, and that's why the colors remain so neutral. As I put in increase my black point, I'm just affecting the brightness channel so the colors don't fall apart on it. And if you work on with a different application that works in a traditional RGB space, you'll move the black point a certain amount, and then the color will start to fall out. The colors will start to get affected. That's not the case with us. Contrast works on zones. So instead of just making your whites whiter and your blacks blacker, as normal contrast curves does, we're applying an amount of contrast to each one of these zones. So in this case, the interior exposure and the exterior exposure, pretty much two distinct zones, have their own contrast amount that's being applied to them. So play with a contrast slider. It'll probably you'll want to see how this adjustment works on your images, but it's a very powerful tool. The detail is the same as the local contrast tool, which is similar to clarity. If you're using Lightroom, you can see as you increase this, adds extra local contrast, which has sort of an effect of sharpening, although it's different than unsharp mask would be. So add that. I like to say season to taste. A tone curve down below will allow you to do some minor tone curve adjustments. If I wanted to just bump the highlights a little bit here, I would finish that off with that. We also have a color neutral dodge and burn tool that was similar to the previous product, HDR Expose 2. We've increased the maximum brush size to make it more responsive for the high resolution cameras like the Canon 5D Mark III and the Nikon D800, for example. So those are the new adaptive tone mapping and merge and alignment tools. I want to show you a different image here. This is an HDR scene that isn't primarily in the shadows. This is one that's kind of primarily in the midtones or highlights. And this was created by a friend of ours, photographer, North Carolina, named John Warner. This is one of his location shots. So here you're going to see the same tools applied, but with a little bit different effect because, again, this is primarily a mid-tone HDR scene and not, as the previous one was, one that was primarily in the shadows. So let's look at this now. This was, if I go back to my reset preset, you can see that the dynamic range here is almost 16 stops. If I just start with my tone map linear preset, you can see that you're pretty in pretty good shape. Let's look in at the color because the color is so important in HDR. And our color model separates the color information from the brightness information, and that's very critical for the color processing. So you see, we can reproduce really natural looking color even in the saturated colors. So here, if I want to brighten the image a little bit, I'm going to go to my gamma tool first. Oops, that's too much. Dial it back down a little bit and get that to where I want it. There is some highlight clipping in here. I can see outside the display zone, and that'll typically be out here in the railings here, the white railings, which is fine. But I'm also seeing a little bit here in the sky, which I do want to recover. So I'll use the highlight tool to bring this back. Dial that up a little bit more. And maybe I'll just take the exposure down a notch. and I can go with that. If I want to now just add a little bit more local contrast to the scene, I'll use my detail slider. And you get very good results. Again, no halos around the windows. And in fact, here you can see that this is a screened-in porch, so we're able to resolve the fine detail of the screen there as well. So that's just another example there. We're getting close to the end of time. What I do want to show you quickly is the Lightroom workflow. I know a lot of people are using Lightroom to manage their images. I have several images here. You can see the exposure bracket here. These were images that, again, that I shot freehand. I'm going to select them all and then go into the merge process. And let's just look at this. A lot of people, when they launch the plugin, will use the right click here to you'll use the export function here. So you call up the plugin here through the export list. Now the problem with that is that Lightroom will send these photos to the plugin using the last settings that you used previously. It can lead to problems because if you haven't set your settings previously, it will send JPEG files to your plugin, to HDR Expose 3. So you don't want to do that. You want to click on the export button, and then you have two choices here to either merge the original images or edit with Lightroom adjustments. Now, if you merge the original images, you'll do the raw files. If you click on merge and edit with Lightroom adjustments, it'll take the images, apply the changes that you did in Lightroom previously, and create TIFF files and export. You'll get the best results if you're starting with your raw files and not images that you've done a lot of work to in Lightroom. So let me click on this and go through this step. And you'll see it'll bring up the same dialog here. I'm going to click on these three. Again, these were handheld, so I'm not going to use the merge static photos option. And I'm going to start the merge process here. So again, it brings up the same user interface that we worked through in the standalone application. You can see it's done the alignment here of the individual handheld images. From the workflow perspective, as I said, in Lightroom, you really don't want to do a lot of pre-processing to the images because it'll affect different exposures in different ways. So the best thing from a workflow perspective is to work with your original raw files, do your tonal adjustments, your white balance, and all of your other adjustments on the full 32-bit data, and then return that back into Lightroom, and then follow up with your finishing touches. If you have spot removal you need to do, or you want to crop and rotate, you'll do that all in Lightroom after the fact. Now, the only case where I know a lot of people prefer to make adjustments in Lightroom first, and the only one that really is truly beneficial as far as I'm concerned is using the lens correction tools inside of Lightroom. So if you apply a lens correction inside of Lightroom and are syncing that across all of your images, you'll get the best. You'll get good results there. And then you'd want to send the images with Lightroom adjustments to the HDR Expose plugin. So I've already gone through the user interface here. All of it is pretty much the same as in the standalone version of HDR Expose. So I'm just going to just I'll do select a black and white preset here, and then I'll say OK. And when I do that, I have a choice of renaming the file. I'm going to send it back as a TIFF. I can send it back as a JPEG too. I'll say OK. Now, as long as you're in the actual folder view in Lightroom that holds the images, you'll see that this image is then returned back to Lightroom and grouped with the original files. Now you can go into Lightroom, into the develop module if you want to, and add a preset, crop and rotate the file. This is something that you would do at the end in Lightroom. So again, the first time at least, click on the export button and select this option. After you've done that now, for future instances, you could use the export to HDR expose 3 option. And now if I pick this, it would launch the plugin right away and send the raw files to it. Okay, so you need to go through at least that step once to determine whether you want to send images, the raw files, or images with Lightroom adjustments done. So that's the Lightroom workflow. Again, the user interface is the same. The presets transfer between the two. And if you prefer to stay in a Lightroom workflow, this is a great way to do it. And it's very efficient because you're starting with your raw files. You're merging them into 32-bit images inside of our plugin in the Beyond RGB color space. You're processing those images and then returning a TIFF file back to Lightroom. And that's a 16-bit TIFF file in this case. So you're not trying to work with 32-bit TIFF files, which are tremendously large and cumbersome. And the only area where you really need the 32-bit color data is for the tone mapping. If you're going into Lightroom and doing brush adjustments or color adjustments or white balance adjustments or you name it, you're not going to need that carry around the full 32-bit TIFF file package. So this is a very efficient way. The plugin comes with HDR Expose 3 and it installs together. If you have Lightroom on your system, it'll install this. If you have Aperture, you're running Apple's Aperture software on your system, we install the Aperture plugin, which works pretty much the same way. The one last thing, and we're getting close to the end of our time, that I did want to cover is 32 Float plugin inside of Photoshop. So I'll start up Photoshop, and while I'm doing this, I'll ask Alfred if there's any questions that I can.
Yes. Is the quality better if TIFF files are used that have been adjusted first for chromatic aberration, white balance, noise, and etc.? Or is it better to start with raw files and HDR expose?
The best tone mapping results, the best HDR results will come if you start with raw files. So that should be your first preference. If you have lenses that have particularly bad chromatic aberration or distortion artifacts, then it might make sense for you to do the lens correction in Lightroom and then merge with Lightroom adjustments. Only do the lens correction part. Do not do noise reduction, do not do color correction, do not do anything that'll change sharpening or anything like that. And the reason for that is that it's going to, if you have 5 different images, 5 different exposure brackets, and you apply you apply the noise reduction, it's going to change those images in different ways in different tonal ranges. You're going to have bracketed images that have some parts that are blurred and some parts that aren't blurred. Try to merge that, you're not going to have a good overlap. So that's why you don't want to do anything that's going to change the images. Also, doing things like color adjustments or white balance adjustments don't make sense because you're doing that on your low dynamic range images, and then you're merging them. And we have white balance adjustment tools inside of HDR Expose that you can work on the 32-bit image data. So the only reason that I would use TIFF files, if I have original raw files to work with, would be if I had really bad chromatic aberration that I wanted to correct. So that's my take on that. Anything else?
Yes. One of the attendees uses Capture One to process files. Can he do the adjustment and bring the resulting TIFFs to Expose 3? He realizes there are no direct path to Capture One.
Um, you could, but if you can work with the raw files again, do the HDR process as the first step in your workflow. Save that out as a TIFF file, and then take that into Capture One to do the final adjustment. The problem, I mean, TIFF files are great, but the problem with TIFF files is that the highlights get clipped in TIFF files. So if you have an exposure bracket and you have overexposed images, there's a hard cutoff on the highlights, and you also have a tone curve baked into the TIFF files. And when we do the merge process, we have to linearize everything to start with. So you're starting with clip data, and then we have to undo that tone curve that's been applied. So that can result in some quantization errors. And if you have very bright highlights, like you have the sun or the in the scene, or you have lamps in the scene, you'll see some posterization around those highlight transitions that you wouldn't see if you were starting with raw data. So that's why I recommend raw data. Let me go through quickly 32 float, and then we'll take up some more questions at the end. This is a 32-bit image inside of Photoshop. You can tell it's 32-bit because it says 32 RGB 32 up here, and you also have the brightness slider down here that's seen here as the 32-bit exposure slider that only comes up when you have 32-bit images. So as I move the exposure slider here, you can see that all the content is actually in this image. But again, it has a dynamic range that's too wide to show on this on any computer screen. So I'm going to call the filter here, it's Unified Color 32 Float, and that's going to bring the image up. And again, it's the same user interface as I showed you in HDR Expose, and you also have the same set of shared presets. So you can start with a tone map linear preset. You can adjust the gamma slider to the effect that you want. You have your black point and your contrast, local contrast sliders. And you have, let me just show the color settings here because there's some questions about white balance. I can select the white balance out here. I can adjust manually the warmth and tint, or I have this 2D representation. Let me just close this up so that you get a better view of the panel. So this is my original white balance, and this is what I'm moving it to. So I have my green magenta axis here and my blue yellow axis here, so I can make white balance adjustments in both directions with one correction. So again, this is happening not only on the color channel since it's a color change, and it is being applied with 32-bit precision. So, and it's done after the merge. So that's why for a white balance adjustment, again, this is something that you want to do on the full HDR data. So that's why I would save white balance adjustments until this part of the workflow. Other color tools that we have here is saturation. I can increase or decrease the saturation of the whole image, or I can increase or decrease individual channels. Color tuning will let me select a single color and make adjustments to the hue and saturation of that single color without affecting the overall white balance of the image. What is missing from 32 float is the geometry panel, which will let you scale, crop, and rotate the image. And that's because when you're using a filter plugin inside Photoshop, you have to return image the same size as you sent it. Down here, I have the choice to return an 8-bit image, a 16-bit image, or a 32-bit image. So I could return the same image back to Photoshop and it's a 32-bit layer or one of these others. So I'm going to pick 16 bits now. When I say OK, you'll see it applies the changes back in here, adds it as a new layer, and adds a layer mask to it. And it's also done the mode change for you. So you've done all the tone mapping now inside of the 32 float plugin, and you said return it as a 16-bit layer, and you can see that it has now done the mode change to 16 bits for you, and shows you that same image that you saw inside the plugin. So that's the 32 float workflow. There are people that tend to work predominantly in Photoshop and want to work with layers and masks and things like that. And that's why we created 32 Float plugin. You'll notice it when you start off with a 32-bit image. Let me just open that original image again. When you open a 32-bit image inside of Photoshop, you'll notice that most of Photoshop's correction tools are disabled. So the type of 32-bit processing that you can do natively in Photoshop is very limited. And when you use our plugin, you have access to the full 32-bit data and all of those powerful tools in the software. The other thing that you don't have with 32 Float is you don't have HDR exposes merge and alignment functionality. You would use the under Automate, you would use Merge to HDR Pro. You go in here and you would click Browse, and they don't have the visual browser like we do. So let me open up that same folder here. I have some shots from where are they? Some shots from Hawaii in here somewhere. And again, this is why I prefer the oh, here they are. That's why I prefer the visual browser, because if you're having to look at just file names, it's often difficult to figure out which ones belong in the bracket. But these I've named Hawaii, so they kind of stand out. And then you'll go OK, and it goes off and does its thing. And by default, when you launch this, it's going to do Adobe's tone mapping, and it'll say 16 bits. But what you want to do is create a 32-bit image, so you change it to this option, and then all the correction tools go away, which is fine because you're going to use the plugin to do that type of processing. You can do remove ghosts and say OK. Now, one thing I noticed on the newest version of Photoshop, the Creative Cloud version, is that it has another option here that says something about doing the tone mapping in Adobe Camera Raw. You want to uncheck that as well, because that'll just send the result to Adobe Camera Raw, which will have the same types of tools that Adobe has. So if you say OK, it's going to go and merge this image. Now it looks like it's blown out the clouds, but don't worry about that. Again, it's a 32-bit image. All that information is still there. If we go in here and adjust the brightness slider, you'll see that it's there. We're going to ignore all that and just go into 32 float. I'll apply a preset to it. I like that. I'm going to return this as a 16-bit file, and I'm done. Okay, so that's the 32 float process. It uses the same core libraries, the same technology as HDR Expose 3, the same, pretty much the same tool set, except for the merge and alignment. So if you learn one product, you'll be able to use them all. And this is a product that's designed for people that want to use primarily Photoshop for their image processing. And HDR Expose 3 is a standalone product, and also the Lightroom and Aperture plugins. So I think that's it for what I wanted to present today. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'll stay on a little bit longer to take any questions that may have come in. But again, thanks for viewing. Hope you have a chance to try our software. We have free 30-day trial versions online that you can download, run on your own system with your own images, see the results for yourself. It's the full version of the product. It just times out after 30 days. So give that a try. Hope you like it. Thanks. Alfred, any questions?
Yes. Is it recommended to use the frames that are darker and lighter than each edge of the histogram?
Not quite sure what that question means. Um, you want to, if you're, let me see how this. So if I look at this image here, at this set here, you can see that there's a gap here between the left side of the histogram and the left edge of the histogram. This means that this frame has all of the shadow information, that there's no shadow information that's. As I go up, you can see now it's starting to hit the edge and I'm clipping the shadow information. And the highlights are still clipped until I get to this range. So you want to make sure that you at least have this kind of a gap. So this one is too close. This probably is a good starting point for this scene. So, and on the shadows, you can often, you can often close out shadows, block up shadows, because a lot of times there's not, critical detail in the shadows. But with the highlights, you want to make sure that you really capture them, because the clipped highlights are very noticeable in HDR images. Anything else, Alfred?
Yes. Should I save BEF file each time?
Um, you don't have to. If your workflow, if you're going in to merge the images and then save out a TIFF file, then you're done with it. If you have the original raw files, you can always go back and create new BEF files. If you're working in a batch mode, you might want to do just the batch merge process and save everything as a TIFF as a BEF file, and then bring it in and process them individually. It doesn't hurt to do that, but you don't have to. You can just go straight from merge to your JPEG or TIFF output.
Um, for Photoshop users, do they need to buy both HDR Expose and 32 Float?
No. If you work in a Photoshop centric workflow, all you need is the 32 Float plugin.
And would you say RAW would be the same as DNG? This user loads all his RAW into Lightroom and convert it into DNG. Any concerns with that?
Yes. So DNG is a format that Adobe created. It essentially takes the raw file and then wraps Adobe's processing instructions around it. So when you open that image inside of an Adobe product like Photoshop or Lightroom, it reads the raw file in and then applies the processing changes, that instructions that the Adobe software has created, and those are shared between Photoshop and Lightroom. So when you look at the image that's been processed, if you did a black and white conversion, for example, you still have the original color raw file, and then there's just an instruction sheet that says, convert black and white. Those instructions can only be interpreted by Adobe application. So if you go through the step of importing a raw file, converting it to DNG, and then sending it to HDR Expose, all we're able to read is that raw file. We can't parse the the Adobe processing information because they have their own proprietary processing engine that reads and interprets that data. So if you're doing that, you're just creating unnecessary work. Send an Adobe created DNG file or just the raw file to the software, you'll get the same result. Because all we're able to do is read the raw information. Anything else?
Yes. What pre-processing steps can be done in, say, ACR or LR before bringing the file into Expose 3?
Ideally, none. The only time that I would say it's worth it to make a change is if you have severe like chromatic aberration issues that you want to adjust before you do the processing. You really don't want, you want to do as little pre-processing to the images as possible, but don't do anything with noise reduction, spot removal, color adjustments, white balance, cropping, rotating, scaling. Just start with your raw files whenever possible.
Oh, okay. When you have moving objects, does the software choose the best exposed object out of each exposure for eliminating ghosting effect?
No, it'll use the keyframe selection. So the software either picks the keyframe or you pick the keyframe, and then the software uses that as the reference. So it starts with that image, and then it matches everything else up to that image. And when there are differences between the keyframe and the subsequent images, it it is biased to take that information from the keyframe versus the subsequent frames.
Okay. And one of the attendees is finding blown out areas when shooting landscapes in the direction of the sun.
Uh-huh.
How would he be able to deal with that?
If you have a good exposure bracket, again, start with the raw files and do the merge, and you should be able to recover that. If you don't have any, well, first of all, you're not going to recover any data, any detail in the sun. That's just not going to happen. But if you have your exposure brackets well that you have some significantly underexposed frames and you've shot in raw, then you should be able to get good results with the sun. I want to take one more question and then I think we're going to have to call it a day. If folks have specific ones they want to email in, they'll get a notification from GoToWebinar and they can respond to that.
I just have one last question. Do you need to create folders based on a photo sequence?
No, no. When you download your images, just download them to the folder the way you would normally do it, and then when you're in here, click on the folder, and then we'll do the rest. Okay. The one thing that I didn't mention before, which I probably should have, you will be filtering your images based on what's in there. So if it comes up and you say, well, I had more images in that folder, I don't know why they came up, that's because your filter may be on. Okay? And the reason we filter that is because you can only merge images of the same type. So you can only merge raw files to raw files, TIFF files to TIFF files, and heaven forbid you have to JPEGs to JPEGs. You can't mix them. So that's why we have the source filter here that will filter and just show you images of the same file type. Okay, well, that's it. Again, thank you. We went longer than I expected, but we had some good questions that I wanted to make sure to cover. I want to thank everybody that's still on the line for being with us this morning. Hope you found this valuable information and hope you enjoy the software. Again, try the 30-day trial version and let us know what you think.